Hi there, and welcome to the Optimized Practice podcast. I'm your host, Emma Price, and today I'm joined by Jordan and Bryn, both from Peninsula HR, and together we're going to be discussing the hot topic that is HR in healthcare practices and the pitfalls to avoid. So thank you both for joining me.
You're welcome.
No problem at all. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. So what are the top 5 tips for healthcare business owners when they're trying to navigate the scary world of HR? Bryn, we were discussing this a little bit earlier. What would your 5 top tips be?
Okay, well, first one is a fundamental one, which is getting your paperwork in place, making sure you've got some protections, some documentation, and it ultimately comes down to staff contracts and policies. And we were talking before, weren't we, Emma, that it's very much on the side of employees, the employment law. Employers don't have any rights in effect. You only have the rights that you care to write down and put in writing, really, in your handbook, and present that to your staff. So that's the most crucial initial element for any, not just healthcare, any business, to make sure that they get that base level down, so there's no grey areas. It's quite clear what you're going to be paying them and what benefits, etc., they're going to get: sick pay, holiday pay, everything in the contract. Crucially, what are your expectations and what are your standards? And that is the bit that wrestles the power back. It levels the playing field in terms of employment law there, and every organisation has got a different view on what's important to them. Might be that some are quite relaxed about dress code or timekeeping. I talk to businesses now that have unlimited holiday policies, and I talk to some businesses who begrudge giving statutory minimum 28 days. So each business is different with how they want to approach it, but it's got to be clear across the board to everyone. That's what your policies do.
So it sounds like you talk to a lot of businesses, Bryn. Can you just explain a little bit about your job role and title there at Peninsula, and how often you're talking to people about this kind of stuff?
Of course, yeah. I'm one of the senior HR employment law advisors at Peninsula. I've been doing this just shy of 20 years this year, actually. So I've seen a lot over the times. Things have changed rapidly, certainly since COVID. I mean, the amount of changes and updates we've had coming in from 2020 is blows out of the water the previous 15 years I was doing it, to be honest. So yeah, 20 years helping that. And when my job really day to day is I'm speaking to business owners. They usually tend to call me when things are going a little bit pear-shaped, to be honest. They don't tend to ring me when to say, look, all my staff are doing great today, they're all on time, they're all doing a good job. It tends to be when someone is pushing the boundaries, doing something they shouldn't be doing. And yeah, it comes down, just to refer back to that previous point, it all comes down to what we've got written down and what options we've got to take. So sometimes I'll speak to existing clients, and we know that obviously the documentation is in place and it's up to date. There's options. We can give options to how to deal with that. And as a business owner, you can then look at the scenario, the specific niche of that, and make a decision about how you want to handle it to a certain degree. But it's the organisations, when I speak to organisations, usually call through almost a bit like a 999 call, where they say, this has happened, what do I do? And I could get 5 or 10 of them a day. And often the advice is limited because of the lack of documentation in the first place.
I love that idea that you're the 5th emergency service. Then the AA, that's fine. And then we've got Peninsula, yeah.
Yeah.
999, yeah. 998, yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Someone's late again. So, oh my God! Right. Let me help you out.
And Jordan, do you want to just give yourself a little introduction now? And I'm sure you agree with the documentation comments that Bryn's just made there.
Yeah, Bryn's the one I call when I've got a problem too. With myself, as I said, I'm a business development manager for Peninsula. I've been here, I think, about seven or 8 years now. So yeah, as you're on these calls with Bryn and you're getting these advice from people like Bryn, it kind of educates you and you start picking up on certain things. And that's why now, hopefully, I'm down as an expert in certain fields, but I'll always say that's Bryn. But in terms of mirroring, yeah, I'd always say that the 2 main points are having your documentation in place, your contracts, your handbooks. We discussed a fair few supporting policies, especially your industry, how relevant they may be. Your restricted covenants, your non-competes, your deductions agreements, your training agreements. But I think getting a ducks in the row at the start, drawing that line, not being too corporate, but not being too lenient, and just making sure you're putting the foundations in place to avoid there being any issues. So you don't have to end up calling Bryn saying, what have I got to do now that something's happened? Be a bit more proactive to prevent them issues happening in the first place.
So point 1, just for clarity, get your documentation in place, get your handbooks in place, get your contract clear and your expectations clear. Fantastic. We're off to a great start. Number 2, what's your second top tip for our audience?
It comes into force really when situations arise. And the most common issues that we tend to have are managing sickness and absences. So that probably the potential pitfalls of not managing those can be quite significant for organisation. It doesn't necessarily mean it's just sickness absence. It could be time off dependence. It could be carers leave, for example. That's a new thing that's come in. So it's understanding what type of absence something is, and then dealing with it through the right process, which is obviously outlined and defined in your policy booklet. I think absences across the board have not just a financial impact, but it has an operational impact, of course, and it impacts the morale of the other staff who are there, who are having to pick up the extra work. And look in healthcare, depending on what whereabouts and what field you're in, it is a stressful environment. You know, it can be emotionally draining, physically draining, and therefore the more likelihood for staff to have time off with burnout and stress, and maybe some trauma from what they've seen or witnessed, or whatever might have happened in work. So managing sickness is something that is kind of at the top of most employers' priorities when I'm speaking to them. Certainly because the change to sick pay rules last week, which has kind of magnified that. So just to touch on that briefly, the rules have changed now. So if someone's off sick, first 3 days used to be classed as waiting days. So if you have 1 day off, 2 days off, 3 days off in a row, you're not getting any sick pay. I mean, it still has an impact operationally and on the staff, but then it's not a financial detriment in that respect. But it's an immediate right to sick pay from day one. So those individuals who might be inclined to have a day in bed might be more inclined because they're going to get paid, 20 odd quid for the pleasure of staying in bed. Keeping a good track of absences is really important, so we can log what if it is getting excessive, then we can manage it again through the process. Usually, you might have 4 or 5 occasions in a year, may start an absence review and could result in disciplinary and warnings, etc. But the key thing really is to understand what type of absence it is, so we're following the right course of action. Because I've had numerous occasions where I've spoken to people who have disciplined individuals for time off dependence, which is basically saying, like, I can't come in today, my little one's not well, or I've got to something's happened, I'll look after a family member and something's happened. I'm the primary carer, for example, and it goes down as a standard absence, and then they're kind of grouped into the disciplinary as part of that. And what you're doing actually is you're disciplining someone for a statutory right. So you're walking into an unfair dismissal claim, automatic unfair dismissal claim, regardless of length of service. So making sure you're logging the absence under the right category is really important. And if you've got ramifications and you're actually following through with those ramifications, people are more likely to manage their own absences. If they know there's rules in place and they know that it's not going to be wavered, then you're less likely to have a culture developing where people start having excess days off. Particularly because in a lot of healthcare, a lot of companies do pay more than just SSP. I speak to a lot of healthcare companies and they'll pay full pay for a week or two or even longer. Sometimes employees see that as their right to take. I've lost count of the amount of times where someone has said, I've not used any of my sick days this year. Well, they're not there to use. It's a safety net, really, and a benefit. But people are going to start getting paid from day one moving forward. I think managing absences is definitely going to be at the forefront of a lot of businesses to focus on this year.
It's nice. I was letting Bryn speak. I enjoy not being having to the person to have to go through it. I was enjoying it. I'd always say, and Bryn will back me up, because the amount of meetings we do, the majority nowadays is down the capability route. When long-term sickness, mental health, anxiety, depression, things along them lines, and people are kind of worried that they can't do anything. If that makes sense. You don't want to be horrible. You don't want to be, I'm off for mental health, goodbye. But you want to be along the lines of, we're going to support you. But if it gets to a certain point and it's going to impact the business, you want to have an avenue to say, we now need to put the business first. So I'm not saying be too strict, but you always should have your relevant policies for capability. You should always have your standards for return to work. You should always have your disciplinary action, your occupational health routes, to say that should we now need to take action, we can do, and we don't have to be worried about discrimination, but we don't have to have left it too long. Bryn, I know we had one quite recently. Would you normally say you'd start the process if someone's off on something like long-term sick after? Would you be talking 2 to 4 weeks, or would you be managing it from day one?
I suppose it depends on if someone sends you a sick note in for 3 months from day one, then I'd start managing it straight away. But usually it only becomes long term once that 1 week turns into another sick note for 2 weeks, and then so it's not often you get a big hefty sick note to start off with. Usually it's around about that 2 week onwards. Anything more than that, even though there's not a definition in law of what is long term sick, 2 weeks off sick is a lot of time. When you think most staff should probably have less than 5 days off a year, on average 2 weeks is a long time. So at that point, yes, you start the process. And that medical capability process is fundamental to avoid discrimination claims. Just because someone's on long-term sick doesn't mean, and maybe has a disability, doesn't mean that you have no choice but to leave them on sick for 6 months or being paid contractual sick pay. You can. It's a bit of a misconception that, but you can actually manage that. And usually, look, by about 6 weeks, if that person is not back into work, and we're at the end of that process, and part of that process is exploring ways of helping them get back to work. So if we've explored those options and it's not possible, and that person's got there's no obvious return in the foreseeable future, we're talking weeks, not months at that point. You're about 6 to 8 weeks down the line. You're usually in a position to say, look, if we can't, if it's having a big enough impact on the business and we can't wait any longer, you usually are able to dismiss someone as early as 6 to 8 weeks into a long-term sick. So I think it's just worth clearing that up, that you don't have to wait 6 months before you start taking action.
As a business owner, at what point, sadly, if one of your beloved team are, off for, let's just say, a week, and they say, I'm going to be off for another week, at what point are employers allowed to turn around and say, when do you think you'll be back? Can you ask that question of them on day one? Can you ask that, when are we allowed to start questioning what's going on and expecting doctor's notes and that sort of thing? Can you clarify that for me?
It's hard to give an exact answer because naturally it depends on the situation. So if someone's come to you and saying, look, I've had an accident, I've had an operation, I'm going to be in hospital for a week or two. Obviously we're not going to ask them within 2 days, keep ringing them, asking them. And that. So usually you can ask, but we just got to be careful about how often and when we have that contact. So we tend to, if someone sends in a sick note, we acknowledge it. So we usually give them a call and say, look, we've got your sick note. It might be for a month, for example. We'll say, look, can we reach out to you in a couple of weeks just to see how your progress has come in, and almost come to an agreement with that. And then obviously at that 2 week point, you'll say, do you think you're on track to come back at the end of the month, or can we look at ways and maybe coming back before if you want some reasonable adjustments, etc.
Like a staged return, is that a thing?
Exactly. Yeah. That's like a phased return back to work. Another misconception is sometimes if someone's off, maybe with stress, home or work related stress, the worry is, well, we can't talk to them about that, and if they refuse any contact, then we've got to leave them to their own devices. It's not the case. They can't just put their head in the sand and ignore things, particularly if it's work related. There's more emphasis that you can actually deal with that as an employer. So yeah, it's to answer your question, it's very much case by case, but you can definitely ask probably more than a lot of people realise. There's a lot more things you can ask them. Yeah.
Because you don't want to overstep, and obviously, I mean, this shocked me. Jordan very kindly came and did a talk. How many rights do employees have?
100, 150 maybe.
And how many rights does an employer have?
Not one.
0 is the answer. So it's a very difficult line to tread. I'm an employer. I love my team dearly, and I want to do right by them. It's a bit of an unknown territory, a little bit scary. You don't want to get this wrong because it is law at the end of the day. So brilliant. Okay, so we've touched on documentation in place. Number 2 was getting your sickness policies in place, but also managing the process properly. So I use Bright HR, which is part of the Peninsula package. Is it okay for them just to keep a spreadsheet? Is that advisable? What in terms of managing sickness?
Yeah, as long as we've got a record, that's the key bit. I mean, the good thing about Bright HR is that you can access data easily, pull reports. When you're using the spreadsheets, it's a bit more manual, I suppose. But as long as we've got a record of the absences, the reasons of the absences in particular, and the key bit really is when we do the return to work meeting, fill in a quick form, get them to sign it, because then they can't change their minds later on down the line. Because unfortunately, some people are pretty savvy, and they'll say, "Oh, actually, no, it wasn't, headaches. It actually was my long-standing health condition those previous times." And if there's no way of going back and showing why,
Top tip then. So return to work form after what? Every absence?
should be. And a return to work meeting it sounds like it's going to be really admin heavy, but it's really not. It's 2 or 3 minutes. Are they fit from a health and safety point of view? So we're ticking that box. Are they safe to come back to work? Because if we didn't do that and they weren't fit and they hurt themselves, then obviously the employers bang to rights with that respect. So it's health and safety point of view, but then it's also just a login purposes to make sure we've got the reason why. And also, it's a bit of a deterrent because if someone is having odd days here and there, if they know that not only do they have to speak to you over the phone that morning to say not coming in, but the next day have to sit in front of you as well, and maybe they could probably come into work. Maybe they just got a cough, a little bit of cough like me, where could have had the day off, but I'm powering through. The reason why we do that often is because they don't want those difficult conversations with it. So it's barriers, isn't it?
A return to work interview and a form to fill in. Fantastic. Okay, swiftly on then. Number 3, what's your third top tip for us?
Third top tip. This is in anticipation to really significant change which come into play at the end of this year. January the 1st, but it's a retrospective action basically. And what we found is that employers find it difficult to understand what the fair reasons for dismissal are, and they can sometimes dress something up as something. For example, redundancy is often used really as to mask maybe a conduct or a capability issue because it's deemed as a nicer way to let someone go. With the changes that are happening at the end of the year, which I'm going to mention shortly, making sure that we are following the right process based on the type of dismissal is going to be fundamental. So the change that is happening later this year, at the moment, there's something called the 2-year rule. We call it that. But basically, anyone under 2 years service, obviously with the week notice taken into account, so just slightly under 2-year service, you don't necessarily have to go through all the warnings before dismissal. You could potentially give someone a final warning for being late, for example, or dismiss somebody because they may have made an error, maybe not a dismissible offence, but for that person, because they're under 2 years service, what's the risk? But as long as we've been consistent across the board is key still, because we don't want discrimination claims. But generally speaking, under 2 years service, usually quite easy. But they're reducing that from 2 years to 6 months in terms of the window from which we don't have to follow, process by the book. So 6 months is a considerable reduction. So from the 1st of April, 1st of January, should I say, next year, anyone with 6 months service at that point, they will have the right to claim unfair dismissal if we don't follow the right process and the right order.
Gosh, that's a big one. Okay, so what are you saying in summary? We have to make sure. Would you recommend then shortening probation periods or having more regular probation meetings?
Exactly that. So it's going to have an impact right from the recruitment. You want to be a bit more belt and braces with that respect. If you don't get references, maybe start getting some references, because you want to make sure the people that you're getting through the door hopefully are going to be good in the first place. Some clients, because of the bit of flexibility with this 2-year rule, some times it's just get bodies through the door. We'll sift through, see who works out well, and then move on the ones that don't. But it's going to be more emphasis on getting the right people through in the first place, which is the recruitment process. The probation periods, a 6-month probation period, is going to be too late at the end at that 6-month point to actually dismiss someone fairly at that, because they're already at the 6-month point. As I mentioned, the tribunal always had a week's notice, so even if you dismiss them within the final week to the 6 months, it's already too late. So probation is probably 3 months, extend maybe a month at a time. Once you get to 5 months, time to make a decision. Yeah, I think some companies are going to be a little bit more cutthroat with the decision making, because again, at the moment, if someone's 80% of the way there, they may just say, do you know what, we'll extend it another 6 months, or we'll pass your probation because we know actually we've got this hidden 2-year flexibility. Companies won't have that option, so they're going to have to make a decision really. Do we pass that person who maybe not quite there in the hope that they do get there? But if they don't, then we're going to have to start managing people through these proper processes. There's no kind of quick and easy outcome there. So yeah, it's going to impact all those different type of things.
It's an interesting one though, isn't it, Jordan? Because I think that's going to make people finding work more difficult for people potentially. If you don't have the qualifications, but potentially I'm going to give you a go and let's see if we can train you up. Suddenly they've only got 3 months to impress, right?
Mm-hmm. I get that.
There's also that point where if you bring someone on and let's just say they go off, they're not very well, maybe it's a genuine disability and they've had even if you start in the medical capability process, they might have missed a month or so and they're back into work. So they don't even have the full 6 months to assess them. And then we can't fail it on the basis that we didn't have time to assess it, because the reason why we didn't have time was the disability. So then we're discriminating against them. So there's going to be the odd situation crop up where someone's not being present enough to really give a proper evaluation. But we've got to be careful if we're going to fail it, that we don't fail it for the fact that they weren't present, because that could be linked to something underlying. So it's going to throw up a whole bunch of new difficult scenarios and challenges for organisations to weave around. Yeah.
After this third point, probation periods need to be shorter. Lots of small interventions, making sure you'll have a very clear path for training. And if by month 5 it's not a hell yes, perhaps you need to think about that person, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so that's a really, really important bit to know. Swiftly on to number 4, because we're going to run out of time otherwise. What's number 4 on your list?
So number 4, I was going to touch on there've been a tightening of harassment laws over the years, and it's only getting tighter, and it's actually going to include third parties liability for harassment by third parties with your staff. So what that means, it's also going to become a standalone whistleblowing right. So someone can whistleblow about harassment and be protected under sexual harassment, be protected under that whistleblowing law. The European Human Rights Commission are allowed to intervene in these cases as well. I mean, there's been some pretty high profile situations where large organizations where the European Human Rights Commission have actually come in and reviewed documentation, put forward action plans, threatened action if they don't put these things in place. So they're getting involved in all this type or any kind of grievance or any issue. You don't necessarily have to raise it through ACAS. They can go straight to that body now and raise it as an issue to them. The third party element is particularly nuanced, because what we've got to take into account is that, look, you can't potentially prevent it as such. If you're working with in healthcare and you're working with patients, members of the public, etc., all we can do is try and prevent it in the best way we can. So that's training the staff on what to do, just generally what is harassment, what's acceptable, not acceptable. Equally, what to do to report it. So we've got a policy in the first place. We've done some training with them, and then what's going to be expected is that we make third parties, i.e., patients, etc., aware of the expectations. So that usually is something along the lines of maybe a little sticker at the reception desk saying we don't tolerate any harassment of staff. You probably see it all over the place now, and no doubt a lot of your group probably have that in place already. But even if you're using subcontractors, locums, etc., that they're also has to be consideration. So that makes sure there's something in that documentation. If you've got builders coming on site for a week doing some renovations, put it in the agreement between you and them. So we've just got to be able to show that we've tried to make third parties aware that we do have a zero tolerance on harassment. So it's not just enough now just to have a policy. You've got to do the training, and it's got to take into account that third party. Finally, it's anticipatory. So even if nothing's actually happened, if a member of staff raises it, those elements have not been put in place, they would have a right to claim on the back. They might resign and claim constructive dismissal because you've not put the relevant steps to prevent the harassment. And that only really tends to happen when you've got a disgruntled member of staff, and they'll say, "Well, I'm going to leave anyway, and I'm just going to throw that, see what sticks." And it's better to have those things in place in the hope that obviously we never need to rely on it, but it's better to have it than not, because you'd be open even if there wasn't harassment occurring.
So have a policy in place, make sure everyone has training, and extend to all third parties.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Okay. And finally, your final words of wisdom for us.
Final words on wisdom. The last one I was going to mention about the additional document. I know Jordan mentioned it briefly at the very top, but I thought I'd just go into a little bit more detail about the importance of those additional documentation other than just the contract and handbook, which are obviously very important. One of them being a restricted covenant agreement, so that prevents individuals from working for you and then thinking, actually, I can have a crack at this myself, and actually I'll take half of the client base and I'll set up right next door. So that will prevent that type of situation arising.
Are they enforceable? Because I've heard on the grapevine they're not really enforceable.
It depends. It's got to be reasonable. So sometimes I'll read a restricted covenant. I think, okay, that's more of a deterrent than something that's ever going to stand up in court. And the restricted it has to take into account the geographical area that you're working in. So if you've got hairdressers in central London, if you put a 10-mile radius on that, that's not suitable. You're probably looking at 500 meters as a restriction there, what's reasonable. But if you're working in quite a rural place and you're in a village, then maybe that whole village would be accountable. So it's the radius, but it's also the period of time. So we're not putting restrictions on people indefinitely or for years and years. You tend to have 6 months, maybe a year. But ultimately, if it's longer than that, it's more of a deterrent in the hope they just don't do it because they're worried that you might take them to court. But back when we advise our clients, we give them the option. Do you want it to be something that you want it to stand up in court, or more of just a threat? So restricted covenants really useful. We've got things like, and then a couple linked to costs, and that's training agreements. So often in healthcare, you're training individuals up on additional qualifications, machinery, etc., and all that type of stuff, and it's a cost to the business.
Courses, or particularly courses and cycle to work schemes and all that kind of stuff. Does that included in there? Yeah.
That's slightly different, the cycle to work scheme, but nonetheless, look, there is some organisations will invest quite heavily in skilling staff, and then what can be really frustrating is that they take all that time and effort and the money that you put into that individual, and then they waltz off and go and work for a competitor. And the worry is that, look, we can't necessarily stop that unless you've got restricted covenant in place and it's reasonable. But what we can say is, look, if that's what you're going to do, if you're just going to leave, then actually we've got it within the training agreement that we can take all that money back off you. So we're not going to pay your final pay, and actually you still owe us a bit more, so we'll take you to civil court for the remainder of that. What it hopefully does is, if you're going to invest in them, then hopefully you should get something out of it. So usually a couple of years a training agreement is in place for. So you put that money in, put that training and that trust, at least get a bit of time. Once you, after 2 years, then it's harder to enforce the training agreement. You don't tend to see them lasting much longer than that. And then the other point is deductions from pay agreements. So that's just basically just telling a member of staff, if you are, if you're dropping equipment, if you're making mistakes, negligence, if you keep driving and bumping into other cars and it's costing us money, then actually we reserve the right, if we want to deduct that money from your pay. Now we've got to be careful as and when you do it, because it obviously can impact people's morale, but hopefully it does what it's supposed to do, which is just make people a bit more conscious that with the equipment, with the company car, with keys, with uniform, you'll certainly get that back if someone leaves. If you say to them, well, if you don't give it back, then I'm going to have to change the locks, I'm going to have to buy a whole bunch of new uniform, etc. They'll soon bring those bits back. So it's all about driving the right behaviour, but it is their worst case scenario to stand up and actually hold that money back.
So it's all about protection, really, isn't it? And just having these things in place so you are, and the rest of your team are safe and secure. But what we teach a lot at the Hive is how to build a culture of open communication and honesty and transparency. So when you're presenting somebody with a document like that, it's like, well, of course that's completely reasonable and fair, and it suits both parties. I want to train you to make you the best you can be, but this is a significant investment, so I'm going to put this in place, and hopefully we'll never need to look at it.
Exactly. That's the key, isn't it? It's when you think about a restricted covenant, a training agreement, and deduction of pay, it's all very fair. It's not like we're saying we're going to deduct tens of thousands of pounds off you because we put you through a course which costs us £1,000. You're not trying to rip people off. It's just saying, look, we just want some reassurance and some protection that we're not going to do all this and then you're going to take advantage of us. Because there are some organisations who don't have these things in place, and I speak to them because they'll call through and say, look, this has happened, and it might have happened on numerous occasions, and they've just lost time, and it's demoralising for the business owner, particularly if they're setting up in competition as well on the back of it. So yeah, it's really important, those docs.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Well, we've been working with Peninsula for a while now, and the lovely Jordan, thank you for joining us, Jordan. You've been working with our businesses. Do you want to tell a little bit about what the Hive, so our Hive members get an exclusive discount? Do you want to just mention that?
Yeah, 100%. I said, so working with Peninsula after working with yourself for, I'd say, a while. I won't know exact dates, for a while now. Peninsula, we've agreed that we can provide every one of Hive's clients up to 20% discount, depending if you use us for HR or health and safety. More than happy to continue that. Just to mirror into what Bryn mentioned before, I think in terms of HR, the simplicity of it is it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. That kind of makes sense with everything, not just your restricted covenants, your training agreements, that's your contracts, that's your handbooks, that's your trigger points of sickness, that's your policies we keep referring to. It's pretty much the do's and don'ts of HR. Hopefully, when you're taking on staff, you don't want to have to go down these routes, but it's bound to happen when you get to a point. And as I said, you don't want to have to fall back and start pulling things out of nowhere and put things in place. You want to have them foundations in place where you can touch upon should something happen. But as I said, yeah, effectively, we support with the lot, with documentation, advice, bright HR, legal insurance, tribunal representation. But like I was mentioning, all the Hive group get access to up to 20% discounts on each of our products.
Very grateful, thank you. I've had to use Peninsula, a few times just for advice, and you are my fifth emergency service. It's so nice to have an expert ear to call upon. So as a fun end point, but either of you, both of you, what would be one uncomfortable truth that you would tell a business owner if you weren't afraid of hurting their feelings?
Bryn, I'm going to let you be the bad guy here.
Let's lay it there. Come on.
Yeah, well, I suppose a lot of my job when I'm speaking to non-clients, usually, I'm having to give them a bit of home truth because they've probably not done something they should have done yesterday, and now it's coming back to bite them now. But I think generally speaking, one thing that worries a lot of clients is the fact that flexible working is something that is a day one right. Anyone can ask for it, and you can't just refuse it like you could do before maybe COVID. You know, it's a lot more. It's here to stay, and I think it's one of those where organisations who take into consideration where appropriate the fact things like hybrid working, they're probably going to be the ones that are going to attract the better staff ultimately, because people now, employees expect more flexibility than ever before, and some organisations don't like the idea of remote working. Sometimes it's not practical. Maybe it's a control element that the owner wants a lot more control over it, but the, I suppose, uncomfortable truth is it's here to stay, and it's only going to become more. I mean, this apparently next year they're changing the rules to make it to make it even more flexible. I don't understand how that's even possible, because we're already at that point now where it's difficult. You kind of got to go above and beyond to refuse a request nowadays. But that is probably the one where a lot of business owners don't want to hear, but it's here to stay.
Yes, flexible working. Okay, well, that's a good one, because all of these things affect us in lots of different ways. And in healthcare, that's a real challenge, because we need to be face to face. A lot of the time. So how can we best be flexible for our team? That's a real problem that we need to work our way around.
Even just going part time, flexible working requests may not necessarily be the location. It's I'm changing my working pattern. I want to finish early. I want to start later, and all that.
Yes, and I'm sure many people want to accommodate those things as best they can, but there is a legal requirement to now. So that's a real thinker. Thank you.
Yeah, you've got to go through a full process now. Yeah.
Alrighty, so I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining us. So that's all for this episode of the Optimized Practice podcast. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and YouTube. Therefore, you will never miss an episode. And don't forget to follow us on all of our social media platforms. If you want help building your practice, please reach out to us at the Hive so we can show you how to build a profitable, stable, and highly respected practice that can ultimately work without your daily input. So we'll see you on the next episode, and thank you again, chaps, for joining me.